Hook a cheesecake that is supposed to burn. That sounds like a cooking disaster, but it is actually the secret behind one of the most beloved desserts on the planet right now. Basque Cheesecake has gone from a tiny pink sauce bar in a small Spanish city to conquering the menus of Michelin-starred restaurants across 6 continents. And the single technique that makes it extraordinary is the exact opposite of everything traditional baking has ever told you to do. Tease in the next 10 minutes, you are going to discover the fascinating origin story of this dessert, why a burned exterior is not a flaw but a flavor revolution, the precise science behind its impossibly creamy center, and the specific ratios that separate a perfect Basque cheesecake from a mediocre one. We will also get into why this recipe exploded globally during a very specific moment in history, and the one ingredient decision that most home bakers get completely wrong, changing the entire texture of the final result. Background: the story of Basque cheesecake begins in San Sebastián, a coastal city in the Basque country of northern Spain. The year was 1990. A chef named Santiago Rivera, who ran a small bar called La Vina, was experimenting with a simple baked cheese dessert. Rivera was not trying to create a culinary landmark. He was trying to solve a practical problem. He wanted a cheesecake that did not need a crust, did not need a water bath, and did not need careful monitoring. He wanted something that almost made itself. What Rivera created was baked at an extraordinarily high temperature, somewhere between 400 and 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and left in the oven long enough for the outside to develop a deep, almost caramelized char while the inside remained completely liquid at the core. He served it at room temperature, and the interior would slowly set into something between a custard and a classic cheesecake filling. Customers were confused at first. Some thought it was undercooked. Others thought it was burnt. But the combination of bitter exterior and sweet, ethereal interior was unlike anything they had tasted before. For nearly 2 decades, this dessert existed almost exclusively in San Sebastián. Tourists who visited La Vina would take the recipe home, whisper about it on early food blogs, and attempt to recreate it in their own kitchens. Food writers who covered Basque cuisine began referencing it as a regional treasure. But the explosion had not yet happened. That explosion came around 2018 and 2019, when food media, Instagram, and a wave of culinary tourism converged perfectly. Food publications began running features on La Vina. Chefs in Tokyo, London, New York, and Sydney started putting their own spins on the recipe. By 2020, during global lockdowns, Basque cheesecake became the most searched cheesecake recipe on Google in 17 different countries. The simplicity of the ingredient list made it approachable. The dramatic visual of that burnished top made it deeply shareable on social media. A dessert that had spent 30 years in quiet obscurity suddenly became a worldwide phenomenon in under 3 years. Main content: understanding what makes Basque cheesecake work requires understanding the core ingredients and what each one contributes. The standard recipe calls for cream cheese, heavy cream, eggs, sugar, and a very small amount of flour. That is it. No crust. No water bath. No special equipment beyond a springform pan and some parchment paper. The cream cheese is the foundation. Most traditional recipes call for full-fat cream cheese, and this is not negotiable if you want the right texture. Low-fat cream cheese contains more water and stabilizers that interfere with how the proteins set during baking. The cream cheese needs to be completely at room temperature before mixing. Cold cream cheese creates lumps that never fully incorporate, leaving you with an uneven texture throughout the finished cake. Heavy cream is the second critical component. The fat content in heavy cream, which sits at around 36%, is what gives the interior its signature silkiness. Some bakers substitute half and half or whole milk in an attempt to lighten the dessert, and this is that one ingredient decision that changes everything. Reducing the fat content produces a firmer, grainier interior rather than the barely set, almost molten center that defines the authentic Basque experience. Eggs serve 2 functions simultaneously. They provide structure and they carry moisture. Most recipes call for 5 large eggs per kilogram of cream cheese, and this ratio matters. Too few eggs and the cake collapses completely. Too many and you end up with something closer to a firm custard pie than the trembling, delicate interior you are chasing. The flour is present in such a small quantity, typically just 2 to 3 tablespoons for an entire large cake, that it barely registers as a structural element. Its job is not to build the cake. Its job is to prevent the proteins in the eggs and cream cheese from tightening too aggressively during the high-heat baking process. Think of it as a buffer rather than a building block. Sugar levels are where significant variation exists between recipes. La Vina's original formula is quite sweet, using roughly 300 grams of sugar for a standard-sized cake. Contemporary versions from pastry chefs in Tokyo and Copenhagen often reduce this by 20 to 30%, allowing the natural lactic tang of the cream cheese to come forward more prominently. Neither approach is wrong. They are simply targeting different flavor profiles. The baking process is where Basque cheesecake completely separates itself from everything else in the cheesecake universe. Conventional cheesecake wisdom says low and slow. A water bath. Gradual temperature increases. Obsessive monitoring for cracks. Basque cheesecake says none of that. You line your pan with parchment paper, pour in the batter, put it in a screaming hot oven, and walk away. But here is what nobody talks about when they describe this process. The high temperature is not just creating a visual effect on the exterior. The rapid heat is generating specific flavor compounds through a process called the Maillard reaction, the same chemical reaction responsible for the complex flavors in seared meat, toasted bread, and roasted coffee. The caramelized top of a Basque cheesecake contributes bitter, smoky, slightly nutty notes that balance the rich sweetness of the interior. Remove that char and you have not saved the cake. You have gutted its entire flavor architecture. The baking time creates the custard center through a very specific thermal dynamic. The outer portion of the cake sets first while the center remains completely liquid. As the cake cools over several hours, the residual heat slowly migrates toward the center, gently setting the proteins without ever reaching a temperature high enough to make them rubbery. This is why cutting a Basque cheesecake too early is such a critical mistake. The magic does not happen in the oven. It happens during the cooling period. Deep dive professional pastry chefs who have studied Basque cheesecake intensely have begun experimenting with variations that reveal just how flexible this base recipe is. Matcha Basque cheesecake became enormously popular in Japan, where bakeries in Tokyo sell out within hours of opening. The bitterness of the matcha powder mirrors and amplifies the bitterness of the charred exterior, creating a more intense version of the same flavor contrast principle. Brown butter Basque cheesecake, which emerged from pastry kitchens in New York and Paris, adds a layer of nutty, toasty complexity to the cream cheese base before it ever goes near the oven. Some chefs have experimented with aged cheeses, incorporating small percentages of manchego or gruyere into the cream cheese base to introduce sharpness and depth. These savory-leaning versions are beginning to appear on tasting menus as a bridge between cheese course and dessert. The structural approach remains identical. Only the flavor direction changes. Analysis: what Basque cheesecake reveals about contemporary food culture is genuinely fascinating. We are living in a moment when the most viral food trends are not the most complicated ones. They are the ones that are counterintuitive and visually dramatic. A dessert that is supposed to burn. A cake with no crust. A recipe with 5 ingredients that produces results complex enough for Michelin-starred kitchens. This pattern appears repeatedly in the foods that define our current culinary moment. The global spread of Basque cheesecake also tells us something important about how food knowledge moves now.